right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Entry Level Left. I'm Jared.
I'm Matt.
I'm Nathan.
And tonight we are talking uneven development. So this is kind of piggybacking on last week's episode on imperialism and, how we touched on imperialism and colonialism and all those sorts of things and how they relate to capitalism in the broader sense. So with that said, let's get this thing started. We're talking uneven development. What is uneven development?
So uneven development in like a Marxist sense is this idea of the dynamics of human history and how they've been formatted by certain things like developments in human geography that are, again, formatted by like competing private interests in a market, government policies, even circumstances in like markets under capitalism. To be more specific, really the Marxist idea of uneven development, or sometimes called uneven and combined development when we get back to, I guess it was Trotsky that sort of popularized the idea within Marxist thought. But this idea of like almost a burgeoning globalization at that point in time in like the early 19th century. But it really describes like unequal distribution of economic and infrastructural resources, inequalities that basically get set in stone or just, like I said, formatted by previous events in history. Those can be colonialism, imperialism, resource extraction, different things that may stunt a country's growth or a population community's growth in one way or one industrial or agricultural sector, while another sector is more developed. And so you get what we would consider uneven development of a community or a geography's infrastructure.
There's also sort of like a neoliberal conception of uneven development. Obviously, we're going to be talking mostly about the Marxist conception, but I think it's interesting to at least kind of know how the establishment looks at uneven development. And it usually kind of falls back to these stages of growth, specifically Rostow's stages of growth. And I'm not going to go point by point, but just to give kind of like a general explanation of what that is. Early on in the stages, countries are focused on getting like exportable crops, for example, like commercialized crops, or they're focused like heavily on raw minerals and things like that. Later on, the economy develops a little bit and they start doing more services, eventually more and more services, and everybody kind of moves into like the more like tertiary type of roles.
Yeah, like administrative, where they're developing an infrastructure. They're like at a middle ground.
Yeah, exactly. And what we kind of see is that, at least from a Marxist perspective, we see that those countries typically aren't the ones who are in control of moving through this process. It usually happens only at the benefit of the already developed countries. So when it comes to, hey, do we want you to stay in your raw mineral stage? Countries like the Congo, for example, will be stuck in that stage for years and years and years because we're not really particularly interested in making sure the Congo develops. Other areas, they're more likely to move on in the progression of things. And when they move on to, for example, like that final stage where they're at mass consumption, literally the final stage is called mass consumption. When they're at those phases, they're now customers. They're like a whole new market for us to sell to because they're a developed country.
And that's, you said Rostow's conception?
Rostow's stages of growth, which is like, if you Wikipedia uneven development, when you see all those like economic development foundation or
like
all
charts
those,
or whatever,
yeah, all those like neoliberal think tanks that like have like the just 5 different words that they use to describe themselves. Those are always like their go-to development phases.
It's like, see, anyone can do it. You start here and you end here, failing to exactly like realize ultimately there's this other more developed party involved that determines whether, let's say, a country like the Congo gets to move beyond their mineral extraction phase and goes on to their more other tertiary phases. And that aspect is so crucial to uneven development because what you've highlighted there is, well, why would that more developed nation keep them there, right? Because they want that resource that they have them developing, because that resource is useful to that developed nation's continued development and continued economic profitability at the behest of another nation. So this is why we're kind of talking about this concept of uneven development, is when the development of one is predicated on the underdevelopment of another.
You got to keep in mind, through these stages of development, they're almost constantly buying more products. Like if you're going to create like a telecommunication system, you're not just going to start building stuff from the ground up yourself. You're going to go buy routers and towers and things like that from usually American companies or English companies or something like that. Or if not, you're at least taking loans from those countries. Or even sometimes, like in the case of the US, a lot of countries will actually switch their currency to the US to get a more stable
exchange.
Exchange.
Yeah.
So it's always to the benefit of the more developed countries.
Sort of a peripheral example would be like medical equipment and medical equipment suppliers. Those type of distribution systems and infrastructure, those are mainly European and American. So, the global south and other places in the world aren't necessarily exporting a lot of that like medical equipment supply or even medical supplies. So that right there kind of tells you that the West and the global North has a more developed ability to be able to export those particular type of commodities where, in the global South, maybe a certain country's economy relied on the export of like copper, for example, like in some African colonies, like we'll get into later on.
We've already started talking, or Matt, you were just talking about this sort of separation of the global North and the global South. And of course, by global North, we mean the more developed nations, Canada, the United States, London, Germany, etc., or London, the UK, Germany, so on and so forth.
Australia is included
right,
there too.
Yeah, right. Compared to the global South, which would be the African countries, South and Latin American countries, that sort of thing. But we're already talking in terms of two separate entities sort of in this sort of expropriative relationship with one another. So with that, how is uneven development related to, but also at the same time different from imperialism and colonialism that we talked about last episode?
So in context of like a capitalist society in which we live, uneven development sort of describes a world that's been, one, transformed from a colonial or imperial era, in which the futures, like we mentioned, of many places or geographies are under the direct control of others, like colonies, satellite states or things like that are under the control of another area or monarch, whatever it may be, to this sort of era in history where neoliberal globalization is taking effect, and we're seeing almost a different kind of imperialism, like we talked about, in the previous episode with the IMF and the World Bank and very financialized imperial behavior. So that is one thing to consider, but also we want to make it clear that uneven development is pretty much considered, as far as Marxism goes, to be a direct remnant of the social relations and dynamics created by colonial or imperial legacies in particular geographical space.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point, right? Is that uneven development is a separate concept, right, than imperialism and colonialism. It's this concept of development of one that is predicated on the underdevelopment of another, right? But how does that development occur at the same time as the underdevelopment of another, right? Through processes of imperialism and colonialism in which a more powerful nation takes over and expropriates the land, the minerals, the resources, the people to manufacture goods or extract goods and resources, open up and develop new markets with the intent to enrich the, colonizing or imperial nation.
Or investing.
Yeah, to enrich the imperial or colonizing nation and in turn underdevelop the colonized or underdevelop the nation in which aggression is being perpetuated upon. And that's a huge component to uneven development. In fact, it's the central component, I would argue.
I think I want to make it absolutely clear, too, for the listener. These aren't natural occurrences. These are fixed events and intentional events of resource extraction or war or imperialism, colonialism, creating things like markets for slave trade and things like that. These are very deliberate actions, and they're very deliberate products of a mode of economic production that is intent on seeking markets for the development of capital accumulation. So they're very deliberate. They're very not naturally developing. They're very much perpetuated by human agents in a depraved fashion for the benefit of one group at the cost of another.
It's this wealth being extracted to benefit the colonizer or imperial nation from those who are being aggressed upon or colonized. And there's something that you just said that I actually want to hit on, is you said they're not natural events. And I really, really want to stress that and being clear, because to kind of go against a right-wing trope or a right-wing narrative
Yeah, exactly.
of like, at least I can speak from personal example, like being in high school and hearing kids say like, or actually scratch high school, talk from our president, calling these countries shithole countries, right? As if they got there on their own, by their own political motives, by their own political processes, as opposed to their systemic underdevelopment. A perfect example, citing a book by Walter Rodney that we'll put in the show notes. I'm not going to quote or pull an exact page number right now, but Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I cannot stress the importance of this book, even just reading passage of it at some point in your life. It's totally PDFable online for the free. He speaks specifically to this idea of underdevelopment and how it's not a natural thing, but Europe and the Western imperial nations would often make it seem as if their underdevelopment was this natural process. And he would push back on it, and he states in there how after the liberatory movements that happened largely in the 20th century, the mid-20th century, across Africa, across Latin America, and so on, the Western powers, when they were colonizing these countries or when they were imperially enacting force on these countries, they were not training the lay people how to be engineers. They were not training them how to be teachers. They were training them to be mine extractors, mine workers. When the imperial powers, the colonizing powers left, they took all of their infrastructure, both physical and social infrastructure, with them, because those people were then left without the social capital and physical capital to enrich their own society by their own means, which in turn left them further exposed to, one, having to go back to those nations, those imperial nations, colonizer nations later on, to get the resources to do that, or be reliant on their nonprofits to train and educate their populace in a way that was completely systemically ripped from them to begin with. And that's how you have these notions of systemic underdevelopment and how they're not natural phenomenon. They're very, very, very much engineered processes.
Yeah, exactly. And like Nathan mentioned earlier in the episode, with the similarities in like the neoliberal attitude or ethic that it employs, it almost externalizes, just like neoliberalism, this idea. Uneven development and neoliberalism, they kind of go hand in hand. They aren't completely distinct concepts, because they're not a parallel, but they work with each other. They're not opposed to each other. But the thing is the cultural ethic or the attitude of neoliberalism that wants to externalize all of the moral failings or the responsibility onto the individual and take no structural responsibility, that bleeds through in our culture. And that's why we see things like this, like Trump. That's one example. And like you were even going to say, like in high school or even online in just passing with, reactionaries or, MAGA chuds like that, they'll make comments about how these countries are just like poor and lazy, or these three Mexican countries, like Fox said recently. And it's like, obviously that's some type of a dog whistle, and has been a dog whistle,
right?
But these are things that have to be stated and can't be stated enough, that uneven development, even when we get down to the local level, which we'll get to later on, these things are not natural. They're very deliberate remnants of the capitalist mode of production.
Right. And that's exactly the point, right? What does this all tie back to? What are we tying all of this into, right? Capitalism. It's specifically capitalist modes of production. Eventually, the capital on the home front is not enough to sustain the continued expansive development within one's own national borders, hence the movement of capitalist projects abroad to extract more revenue and more wealth and more resources to continue to expand and grow the economy of the quote-unquote mother country.
Yeah, and this isn't just limited to like African countries. This
No.
also applies to neighborhoods or
Right.
cities as
Right.
well. So it's not just class control of a whole nother country. It's also controlling your own population.
Right. And I think, Matt, you were just talking about, you were connecting all of this to neoliberalism, right? Neoliberal capitalism. And as we spoke on our whole episode of neoliberalism, while it is, yes, this more globalized, more financialized element of capitalism, which very much plays a role in and is almost the other side of the coin with uneven development, neoliberalism also happened in cities. It happened in neighborhoods, right? It was enacted upon every borough of civilization in the US, for example. And so that kind of goes into our next question, which is, what are the various scales of uneven development? How is uneven development enacted upon a population, and at what level?
Like we said before, it could be a city. You know, there's even internal divides in certain cities, like Chicago, for example. The south side of Chicago is a very different place than the north side.
Right.
I can ask you right now, what's the stadium in Chicago?
North.
What's the famous stadium, right? Wrigley Field.
Oh,
Everybody
right.
I
knows,
thought you were
right?
asking in
Right?
which part
Right?
of Chicago.
No, I'm asking the audience. They're just not responding.
Right.
What's going on here?
This is a podcast.
Yeah, it's
They can't hear us.
not yet, right?
Not yet.
Live stream it. No, that's the famous place. And if you go to Wrigley Field, it's like a kind of like a historic district. It has
Right.
all those like gentrified, like cool sports bars and
Right,
things
of
like
course.
that.
Yeah, the
There's
Pinkberry.
hotels everywhere like that. But you might remember there's actually another team that plays in Chicago, the White Sox.
Right.
But you go over there, that's on the south side. Completely different environment. It's actually right off a 12-lane highway across from the two of the biggest public housing projects in the U.S. are located right across from the
Right.
stadium. There's like no investment in there. It's like a big, they literally call it a concrete coliseum, I've seen, is what's referred to. And the name just brushes past me. And you can see why even within one city, there's sometimes a huge divide between what people experience.
You talk about Chicago, and we're just talking about uneven development and these like historic processes of disinvestment that cause the systemic underdevelopment of particular areas. I mean, Chicago is like one of the most infamously redlined areas in the entire, like from a planning
They
perspective.
said it was like invented there.
Yeah, I
is
mean,
what I've read.
from a planning perspective, you're talking about entire groups of people who were just flat out, no matter what they were going to do, they were going to be denied the opportunity for a mortgage, which, going all the way back to our very first episode, what is the like modern equivalent of a mortgage, right? It's land. It's access to land and capital, and the opportunity for investment and sustained investment over time, generationally. And so when you have an entire group of people completely removed from that opportunity because of things like redlining, when you have an entire group of people who are essentially redlined out of ever having access to that mortgage, that land, that capital, then there is no opportunity for them to, generationally reinvest in their own future and reinvest in their own families and their own social and economic reproduction over time. And that's why then you have the south side of Chicago today, right? A completely disinvested, urban, downtrodden
Wasteland.
Yeah, and that people say, oh, it's got there because of its politics, or it's got there because its
The
people
gangs.
are lazy, or the gangs,
yeah.
as opposed to the fact of the matter, which is complete and total underdevelopment.
Wait, guys.
Planned underdevelopment.
I mean, that's cool, Jared, but I think it maybe has to do with the strict gun control laws.
Oh, dude, that's it. Legalize guns and Venezuela.
Yeah, arm the workers.
Okay, so that whole point of discussing Chicago, that's just one of many instances we can speak to and we're going to speak to later. But the main point really that we're trying to drive home here is that there are a varying degree of scale when it comes to uneven development. It can happen at the global level, happen at the national level. It can happen at the literal local down to, a tale of two cities, basically. But with that said, what is the legacy of uneven development today?
To make it very, very clear for people that may not yet grasp the mechanics of it, take, for example, maybe an export-based industry in a particular country, like maybe Zambia in Africa, that is known for their copper mines and their wealth that was extracted in the colonial era with the British South Africa Company. They basically developed that mining and mineral aspect, or that mineral industry, and they left the infrastructure kind of like behind. They were so focused on making this export sector for minerals and copper into what it became that they let things like educational or industrial infrastructure just not get any sort of development or investment. What happens in this type of example over time is those developments become very, very acute. And you see that this sector of industry has been so heavily invested in, but this other sector of industry is so poorly invested in that you have whole communities that depend on this resource extraction and this production of mineral resources, that they don't produce any scholars, they don't produce any people of different industries or innovation in any type of industry, and they only rely on this one segment of industry or in some cases agriculture. What happens long term in those type of circumstances is that underdevelopment in those other agricultural or industrial sectors become more and more acute, and then social problems develop from those things. And then you have the neoliberal era where the IMF comes in, offers a loan, the structural adjustment policies in the 80s and 90s. So these are the type of things that create a legacy that follows a particular community or country or even a global region into the modern era and creates these structural, social, and sometimes ethnic problems or tensions in a particular geography.
And to piggyback off what Matt's saying here too, is the way economies are structured has a lot to do with the types of products that they're developing. For a country like the US, where we develop like sophisticated technologies like jet engines or something like that, it takes many different segments of an industry to actually make that an accomplishable goal. When it comes to something like resource extraction, it requires very, very unskilled labor, and it requires very few laborers. It's hard to have an entire country who's just extracting resources. You only need so many laborers to do it, and they don't need to be very educated. So when we are developing them, any country, to the level that we can start extracting resources, we don't really need anything outside of that. There's really no incentive to go beyond and, for example, create education or healthcare institutions that will be good for the rest of the population.
The domination of like one country or area or region in context of like imperialism or colonialism doesn't necessarily mean that the dominated country or the colony is prevented from development altogether, but rather it develops mainly according to the requirements of the dominating country. So that's the primary takeaway.
One thing you were saying, you were bringing up how they are sort of forced to continue to do this task or extract this resource or farm this land to produce this one crop because historically it's what provides them with a source of income that allows them to meet some sort of need that they are required to have to survive, to reproduce their own existence, right? At the same time that that's occurring, they don't have the capabilities because of that, because of how stringent their resources are and their opportunity, to just make ends meet is so strapped. They don't have the opportunities to invest in other things like producing engineers and doctors and all that sort of thing. So at the same time, that capital is compounding at an interest rate of 3%. You have inequality and systemic underdevelopment compounding alongside with it,
So gains and losses.
Right. It's growing just as fast, if not faster, at the same amount of time that the expropriating nation is getting that resource. And so you have this continued systemic underdevelopment. And what you were talking about, too, about Zambia or whatever, when the South African British company, whatever, left and it left all that infrastructure, right? What did they have? What did they use the locals in that country for, right? To swing sledgehammers, to break, big rocks with smaller rocks or whatever to get that resource. But they weren't training any of them to actually operate the facility. They weren't training any of them to update and re-equip the machinery with the necessary things to keep it functioning.
Or an understanding of geology or science or anything like that.
Or any means to systemically keep themselves growing and able to reproduce a society that can actually achieve some sort of investment long term, right? It was just this basic task, and then they, left all the infrastructure with no one with the capabilities to keep it up and operate it over time. But they're able to, at the same time, wipe their hands clean of it because they're like, hey, but we left, though.
I mean, that is the legacy of colonialism, and some of our more, seasoned leftist listeners may be aware of Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso and how he was very adamant that we don't want to take this aid. If they want to give us plows and tools so that we can aerate our own land and develop our own agriculture, then that is what we consider aid.
Right.
But we won't consider a dependency or a system of dependency real aid.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because what ultimately happens when nations do go to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, or the World Bank, or any of these institutions for the loans to invest in this, right? Say they do go to these countries and the leaders of these countries actually use them with the best intentions to invest in the people and all that stuff. Even if they get the money required to actually produce the doctors and engineers and infrastructure and all that they need, the debt is so crippling afterwards that then what are they required to do in order to pay back that loan? Gut minimum wage.
Austerity.
Austerity. Gut minimum wage, gut healthcare, gut quality of life, gut social spending, gut the same infrastructure they just spent up building, and then what do you have? They go right back to the same situation they were in before. Do whatever you can to make a quick dollar because you have to survive, and therefore the inequality compounds at the same rate, if not greater, than the loan interest rate that they're therefore trying to pay back.
Right. So a very select few profiting off the complete domination of the many, kind of like colonialism.
Yeah, or capitalism, because that's ultimately what we're bringing it back to, right? Because even on the precondition that you do get a loan from the IMF or the World Bank to do these sorts of infrastructure projects, social infrastructure projects, first of all, they're giving it to nations that adopt their market logic, which is you are a fundamentally, primarily capitalist nation operating under a very free market capitalist logic, which means that all that money that you're getting for the loan that's supposed to go to social infrastructure is going into the hands of a few fucking billionaires, or millionaires, that already run your fucking country.
Yeah, when you take a loan, they want to create somebody who makes cheap goods, or they want to make somebody who has lots of customers for them.
Or they want to take that money and give it to, once again, all those elites
the business
that
class
already exist in there, and just say, hey, by the way, crack down even harder on your workforce so you can get even cheaper goods out of your country at a quicker rate. And then if they don't comply, call them a monstrous dictator and invade their country and put whoever you need to put in power to have them abide by that logic.
I sort of thought about the legacy of uneven development on a more individual level, specifically like material conditions. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is because I think it's a word that if you start reading around kind of the leftist circles a lot, you're going to see material conditions everywhere. It's a pretty big concept in leftism. But kind of what makes this thing uneven development kind of fundamentally unethical is how socioeconomic status is a predictor for pretty much any bad thing you can think of, whether it's like mental health or like avoidable diseases,
life expectancy,
or even like, I was surprised reading this one, how effective therapy can be. Therapy is actually less effective on people who are of a lower socioeconomic status. They get worse education. They're more likely to commit crimes. Just anything that you can think of that could go wrong for somebody in poverty, it's probably going to go wrong, or is more likely to go wrong. And if it doesn't go wrong for them, it goes wrong for someone around them.
Their kids.
It's their kids or their parents or something like that. And so it creates this kind of cyclical nature when you're in these kind of conditions.
Yes, I mean, Jared says poverty charges interest.
If you get a chance, there's a really cool article on the APA website, the American Psychological Association, and they have a breakdown of how socioeconomic status correlates with all these different things. And it just blows me away to look at all these different direct correlations between someone's material conditions and their outcomes.
Right. And that's actually a fundamental point in bringing up too, is even when we say what are someone's material conditions, it's not just their access to capital, it's not just the amount of money they have, but it's literally the state of their material affairs, meaning what is the condition of their, what is their housing situation like? What is your health standing like? The things that directly have a material impact on you. Those would be the material conditions that you comprise as an individual, you know?
Yeah, and I would say to the ethical component, if you consider yourself someone who champions liberty and justice for all, you know, not to get cliche, but if you are someone who champions liberty and justice for all, you should be principally concerned with the well-being or socioeconomic well-being of, you know, an individual, because that allows them to pursue those things. It allows them to pursue what they would consider in like philosophy eudaimonia, which is, you know, the good life or a life well lived.
This hops back almost to our first episode. I think we quoted like Liz Brunegg and Nathan Robinson. Leftists genuinely believe that we can reach liberal ideals better than they can, just based off of what we know about material conditions and the way capitalism works.
Yeah.
Are you saying, Matt, that libertarians need to self-crit?
Basically.
All right. Anyway, going off what we just kind of talked about, we've mentioned it, we've talked about it, but this is a leftist pod. We have to really reinforce this. How does capitalism reinforce or fundamentally enable market attitudes that trend towards uneven development?
There's like several layers to this. There's like the unconscious elements, which we have talked about before, kind of the structural attitude of capitalism. There aren't necessarily bad actors. There aren't like bankers or CEOs that are in boardrooms that are like, yep, there it is, Zimbabwe. That's going to be the next target of what we're doing. But when they do things like buy products from that country, and that country, that's like an unethical product that's developed. So, for example, Colton, which we use in pretty much any kind of technology, cell phones, printers, everything. The DRC, for example, has pretty much monopoly on that, and they cause conflict. They cause internal strife. They, I think they actually have like slavery literally in the Congo still. And these conditions are completely unacceptable to someone who's in the U.S., but when you're on the other end of that business and you're just buying coltan, you're not really considering the sort of like ethical dilemma behind it.
Yeah, you're removed from it.
Yeah, so
it's all about profit acquisition.
Yeah, there are
hence
like
capitalism.
And I can understand there's like unconscious elements, and sometimes it's impossible to really dive deep. You might not know where it comes from. Sometimes they launder things. Like sometimes you don't even know where the coltan comes from or where the diamonds come from.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, go watch Blood Diamond, guys. Come on, it's a great movie. Leonardo. There's also like the conscious elements too. Like, don't lie. There are like the Dick Cheney types who are literally like in the fucking White House sitting next to the president being like, go to Iraq.
Right.
Go to
Yeah,
Iraq.
like just like whispering.
And usually they're associated with both like economic actors, like Lockheed Martin, you know, was a big part of that. You can Google it and go down the whole rabbit hole about
Of course.
how many ties they had to people in the White House at the time. You can even go to political ones, like AIPAC had a huge part with our stance in Iraq at the time too. So it's not just economic, but also political reasons for us to kind of impede on the development of certain countries. And then I would say there's one more element too, and this speaks to how reactionaries typically look at these developing countries. There are natural reasons that countries don't develop. You're a geographer, you probably know better than anyone. So there are just sometimes countries that aren't inclined to prosper. Like sometimes like the climate can be too harsh for crops. Sometimes if they're right in that sweet spot in terms of heat, there might be a lot of disease, for example, that negatively affects the labor markets and also might affect cattle too, is a big part of it. So they might not be ready to develop. But the thing is if you step back and think, well, what's going to solve that? Is it capitalism? Is capitalism going to extend an olive branch to a place that is otherwise unprofitable? Or is a new system going to do that?
I mean, history tells us no, because what history shows us is capitalism has shown in history to not be equipped to solve those problems structurally for countries, because ultimately what a colonial or imperial or investing agent will do will go into these countries or go into this locale, and they'll develop the resources that are already at a good place, whether they be the mineral resources, the oil resources, or some other thing. They will develop that sector of industry to be very efficient, whereas the other sectors of the industry and the population will suffer because of that uneven development, you know, as we're talking about tonight. So capitalism is not really concerned about these things from a capital accumulation standpoint. And from a market standpoint, it doesn't make sense. Why would you develop a sector of industry in a particular country where it's lagging behind, where you could just go into another place where it's more accessible or
has a better resource?
Yeah, exactly.
Like look at West Virginia, for example. You know, it's like we've left coal behind. We've now found better methods of creating energy than coal. You know, they're more accessible. And
But at one point, that was a market.
Yep.
That was a huge
or
market.
it's not even that we're not using anymore. We've just literally blown out all our fucking resources there. Like,
and so we move on. Now
Right.
West Virginia is a shithole.
Yeah, and,
Right.
and not that there
but
isn't
a planned shithole.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
And
A
it's not
planned
that there
shithole.
isn't-
Listen, if you're listening from West Virginia, fuck you.
no, don't say that. No,
No, really, no, fuck.
Isn't
West
that
Virginia.
guy Robert Ojeda from
Are you talking about that
Are you
former
calling
Trump
people
guy?
out
That
on-
guy sucks.
what's that guy's name? Ojeda?
No, the guy who was like, "Oh, I voted for Trump, but now I'm against him."
Yeah, his
total
last name-
dickhead. Total dickhead.
Last name Ojeda, and he was like a former like infantryman or something
Yeah.
like that. He's basically just he got pretty popular online with kind of this like shock and like anti-Trump sentiment, but he's like a total grifter and
He's a total loser.
He's from West Virginia, I think.
Yeah.
And he got big in those political circles and kind of used the Democratic Party to get a more, wider audience. But the thing is that I was going to get back to and say is, it's not that there's no coal left in West Virginia. It's getting depleted to the point where it's not economically viable in a market sense
Right.
to continue to invest in extracting
Or
it there.
yeah, it's more expensive to extract than
Exactly.
it is to sell it.
So
yeah.
that's capitalism in a nutshell. Why would I extract it here and invest here when I can invest half of that and get more resource back? So it's really about markets, just the way it's designed to work and produce in a systemic sense. It cares more about efficiency and extraction of resources for the lowest amount of cost than it does the equitable or equal development of all sectors of industry for the liberty and the justice of all people in those areas. There's no such thing as democracy and capitalism existing together. They're not synonymous. A lot of people on the right think that they're synonymous terms.
free free market.
Yeah, free market.
market.
You would think that it's this like bastion of individual rights and freedoms, but when you get right down to capitalism, how it works on a superstructural level, it's anything but that.
Even then, like everything we've just been talking about right now, right? I mean, you take that example of West Virginia. I mean, you essentially have like a place that has been structurally underdeveloped, right? They've extracted all the coal they possibly can. They got all of the people there to work in one primary industry. And now they've blown so many holes in so many fucking mountains that they can't extract any more coal that's going to make a profit for them. So their industries are leaving or disinvesting. And you have an entire populace laid to the wayside, of which now a massive pharmaceutical industry is taking advantage of by pumping opioids into these people's systems. But that said, I want to draw another point here because we're talking about capitalism, we're talking about uneven development, we're talking this from pretty much a large critique of like kind of right-wing economics. But however, we must not forget, since we're on this topic of uneven development and using West Virginia as an example, of the liberal response, right? Because the liberal response is, instead of saying, okay, this capitalism has disinvested in your communities,
Wait,
and
wait,
we're
I got
now
this.
hold on, let me finish, Nathan. Instead of or now that capitalism has disinvested in your community, we're going to now reinvest it through perhaps the implementation of a Green New Deal, or put your kids through, college or something so that they can get off of this, whatever the case may be. Instead of doing that, you have, right-wing shills or liberal shills, whatever, like Hillary Clinton going there and just laughing at all these people and saying how, coal is dead and we don't need it anymore. And what are you laughing at over there?
Yeah, I mean, but yeah, come on, Hillary.
Dear West Virginia, learn to code. Thanks,
Yeah,
liberal.
yeah,
Yeah, right.
Dear West Virginia, www.codeacademy.com.
Right. Who was that recently?
No, it's a
What
there
was it, John Stewart?
No,
Oh.
there was a John Oliver segment on there's like a program there that's teaching people how to code that are like former
Right.
miners, but there's like 8 people in the program, so
Right.
it's like
And none of them are going to be successful from it. I'm sorry, they're not. But like, they should. Here's a plan. Here's a Green New Deal. Everyone who's going to not be able to work in that industry anymore, we're going to buy you out and let you retire and live off of some kind of welfare forever until you die. And your children are going to be guaranteed a serious, investment in their education to train them in whatever the fuck they want. But we're not going to just say, fuck you, learn to code.
Well, there isn't I think I heard of an initiative in West Virginia to sort of pay for the medical expenses of a lot of these coal miners who've come down with things like black lung and so on. So obviously there is an element of liberalism that is trying to look at these things and try to adjust it. But really the biggest thing is that it's just a Band-Aid. Like, if we don't fix the structural problem, which is the way capitalism produces, then these things are just going to reproduce themselves in different ways and different manners all throughout history. Right. That's Marxist historical materialism for you.
To even get back to the original point, how is capitalism reinforcing, market attitudes that tend towards uneven development? Obviously, we've hit this point like pretty clearly, but to really just bring it home, capitalism is only geared towards doing one thing, and that's extracting wealth out of a particular area, out of a particular geography, from a particular market of some kind. And in doing so, its only care, its only investment is in whatever that resource or product or market is. And should it be tossed to the wayside, should it be thrown into capitalism's dustbin of history, should it be fundamentally, raptured and destroyed, or the people there only be trained in one single, screwing the light bulb into the car as it's on the assembly line or whatever, all that matters is that profit acquisition. And it does not care in any which way about what happens to any of the people involved, to the environment in which it operates in, nothing. And it has no boundaries. You were talking earlier about this area is too hot, or maybe it's more prone for this. Capitalism doesn't care. If there's a resource there, it's going to find a way to develop that area. It's going to make a profit off of it. And then when all's said and done, it's going to pack up and leave, and it's going to leave everything in its way completely and fundamentally devastated, systemically. Hence the perpetuation of uneven development.
And cheap labor, too. If there is cheap labor that they can exploit there, they'll absolutely do it. In a developing area where they need the economic resources and security, they'll absolutely go in there and offer people half of what they would pay, a high school kid to work at McDonald's, to do even more difficult labor, even more backbreaking and physically demanding labor for just nothing. So, yeah.
And with that said, moving on, we've kind of started talking about it a little bit. We've kind of hinted at it, but how are social relations like ethnic tension, globalization, and culture relevant to examples of uneven development in history, today, whatever the case may be?
So this goes back to that cultural ethic or that attitude, but I think we can all understand how racism is a definitely useful tool for the ruling class to divide up the working class and deflect the root cause of these issues, like we were talking about in West Virginia particularly, and there are a myriad of other examples in history and even currently. So these root causes, like underdevelopment, uneven development, which we're talking about tonight, are oftentimes like obfuscated or hidden from view from the working class, so that we don't look at them in the sense that capitalism and the way it produces is failing us. We look at it as just the way things are. There are a lot of platitudes that fellow working people utter almost as like truisms to try to cope with just the chaos of markets and capitalism, which really does not make sense to them, or they don't understand it in a structural way that we're trying to, purport. But these things ultimately create tensions, and they can create tensions within white working class versus like a white collar sector or a business class, or even like a neo-Victorian white yoga teacher class, or whatever you want to describe it as. But it can be within a particular ethnic group, but it could also be across ethnic boundaries as well. And like I was mentioning, with deflecting the root causes of these issues, like we said in West Virginia, government policy can also influence these things as well. And often sort of, especially on the right, get people to look at these structural problems and scapegoat other groups, usually other ethnic groups, because there are already negative sentiments there that they can exploit and use as a deflection or a scapegoat tactic. But a lot of this goes into like the community scope of uneven development. So to that degree, we'll talk about like gentrification. Gentrification being this concept where neighborhoods or communities are quote unquote revitalized by new investment driven by like a cultural appeal or some type of like cultural extraction from one type of community, usually like white, rich, middle class or upper middle class communities, invading an otherwise like ethnic neighborhood and taking what they consider this hip feel or artistry, arts, music, and culture, and co-opting the root of that, whether it's based on some type of working class solidarity or common struggle that the art and the culture there is based off of. They will co-opt it and then revitalize it, quote unquote, into this appealing market flavor so that investors come in and invest in the neighborhood. Now, you think this might be a good thing, but what it actually ends up doing is it raises the rent, it raises the cost of utilities and products, and it displaces these people who historically had lived there, and over time erases the essential character that these neighborhoods had, turns them into this like neo-Victorian playground for these usually white upper middle class or bourgeois people. So that, I think, is where racism sort of intersects with this inequality in terms of like the housing market, in terms of real estate and markets for resources that people need, like housing.
I think that the key takeaway to what Matt is saying is that if your English literature teacher in high school ever makes you read about the Harlem Renaissance, he supports gentrification. So don't do your homework.
No, I mean, I think like in regards to this discussion about, how social relations, ethnic tensions, all that sort of things are relevant to uneven development, and you were talking about gentrification, the reason why it's so problematic, reinvestment sounds like a great thing. You're finally putting money into roads and shit that were falling apart. But that's exactly the problem, actually, is because communities for years could live and develop this culture and the solidarity and this type of like aesthetic, right, that like people like, but the area is still completely disinvested in because it's associated with a particular like class of people or people who aren't profitable, right? Or areas that aren't profitable. So what gentrification does is it essentially goes into areas like Harlem and open up, white-owned, jazz-themed craft brewery joints, right? That charge you a premium for a shitty IPA that in turn cause all the rents in the area to go through the roof and then push out all the people in the neighborhood that made the neighborhood what it was to begin with.
Yeah, that gave the neighborhood the social capital.
Go to New Orleans. Like it is like you're in a neighborhood that literally has like a black dude playing a saxophone like painted on like a mural on a wall, and every fucking person who lives there is like lily white drinking canned rosé down the street.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
And
like
LaCroix.
Yeah, it's just like what? But like under capitalism, speaking from a geographical and planning perspective, under capitalism, you either are like outwardly fucking reactionary and are like just let real estate eat everything and anything in its way, or you're a gentrifier, because gentrification is kind of you meeting halfway with the worst elements of the real estate state, as coined by Samuel Stein, but also still, like you're still preserving an aspect of the neighborhood or whatever, but at the same time, you're still pretty much letting the market run rampant. It's just not, to the degree that it has in places like maybe Manhattan or something where you have like $1 million rents, and shit like that.
I think it really is characteristic of this, like this neoliberal like ethic or cultural attitude. It's like, we want to look like we're revitalizing things and creating this like sprawling urban community where everybody thinks it's just awesome to just walk outside and interact as if, we're in like a neo metropolis or like a neo Athens,
Right.
But really, like under the surface, there are a lot of not only like, it's such a cliche term, but like microaggressions, but economic violence too, displacing people and throwing people out of the buildings that they grew up in and that their parents brought them up in and that their, grandparents lived in. This is a form of like economic violence.
Well, yeah, and it is. And I think that's kind of the crux of everything we've been talking about with uneven development is that it's a sustained economic violence that happens sort of behind the scenes. It's not regularly something you see happening or can really point your finger on. And relating that whole discussion we just had and you sort of introduced about gentrification, and it may have seemed like, okay, we're talking about it, we're defining it, but how the fuck does this relate to uneven development? Well, it relates to uneven development because exactly what I just said, right? You're meeting halfway with the real estate state, aka you're really like they're getting 75% of what they want. And that, yes, you're preserving maybe the character of the neighborhood, but all the people that were there that made the neighborhood what it was, you've completely pushed out, and thus in turn continued their sustained economic underdevelopment because they're not actually getting to participate in that growth. They're not participating in that reinvestment. They're not participating in seeing their schools and their infrastructures improved. It's like, yeah, the neo-metropolis and what you're kind of referencing, this sort of like concept of like new urbanism, is it's really like, hey, I want to be in these walkable downtowns and see all these cool hip people, but they better not fucking bump into me wrong. They better not like look a certain way
or ask me for money.
I better feel safe as hell. There better be I want to live in a smart city,
Better
aka
be clean,
a camera on every corner. And yeah, there better be a street sweeper everywhere, making sure everything, aka the police, making sure everyone's sort of
restaurants should be up to code.
Yeah,
and clubs should have defined
and everyone
standards.
needs to be interacting in a certain way with a certain character, and make sure you're not loitering in any place for too long. So it's policing all of the things and pushing out all of the things that made a particular area what made that particular area, and taking all those people and their historic legacies and continuing to underdevelop them.
Yeah, because really it's not the black people or the Latin American people that benefit from these things most often. It's the white property owning bourgeois class that is displacing these people from their investment and property development, and then they'll move them out of these cities and then bust them in for these $12 or $13 an hour jobs. And then it's like, there are your social tensions right there, because they're interacting with these people and seeing that these rich white people are now in their spaces that they once inhabited. And what do you think that that's going to do? You think that's going to create like a good, like wonderful feeling inside that that these property developers are revitalizing their community and caring about their culture? Mm-hmm. No, it's going to make them extremely angry. It's going to make social problems.
Yeah. I mean, the vast majority of people in the U.S. rent, right? And that's even more so true. That's even more true in urban centers.
Right.
So when you have this kind of hip, hopping, cool urban place, you guys know the feeling of living in a house and your lease expires and then you get another lease, and for some reason it's $50 more.
Right.
Well, can you imagine that if they said, actually, it's going to be $600 more per month because they opened up that really cool restaurant, that really cool bar, and there's a venue right there,
right,
and there's that new park. Like, oh, you live in a really hopping place, so you got to pay for it.
Yeah.
Well, then where do you go? You know what I mean? Do you move
now you live in a
farther?
walkable downtown, which basically means you have an upcharge.
How is it my fault that you decided to, now why is the cost passed on to me? All I did was live here.
Well, and that's the thing, going back to what you were just talking about, renters, and it goes all the way back to that first point when we were talking about local examples, Chicago, redlining, all that sort of stuff. The systemic underdevelopment of a lot of predominantly black communities in the United States, for instance, that redlining has prevented them from ever owning the capital necessary to own stake in their own property, in their own land, own their own home. And therefore, they don't have control over these, revanchist fucking landlords who, the next month are like, well, you live in a walkable downtown. And it puts a class conflict, too, between like planners and stuff, because what is a planner's goal? Like when you come out of planning school and you're like reading all these books, you want walkable downtowns. You want to be able to live, work, play. That's not a problem, but under capitalism it is, because all of those things, it's like SimCity, right? When you play SimCity, the more walkable your downtown is, the more parks you have, the better the residential areas look, the more well kept they are, the further away they are from the industrial zones, the more money you as a mayor, in SimCity make. And that's how planning is, because planning under capitalism is very similar. The nicer your downtown, the more walkable it is, the better access you have to public transit, the more parks there are, the more rent you have to pay, right? As opposed to saying these are things that should be completely socialized and publicly owned and publicly reproduced.
Because people need them.
Because everyone has the right to the city, as coined by David Harvey. Everyone has a right to a city. It's a public space. It's for the public. It's by the public. Our infrastructure, our tax dollars built it. We should fucking own it.
As we talk about gentrification, I think every listener should really own it. Yeah,
own it.
Gentrify your own town. No, I think anybody who really listens to this should really think about the area in their town that this might be like. For me, every time we talk about this, I'm thinking about like Ybor, for example. If you live in Tampa and you want to go clubbing or you want to go to like a bar or like hang out in a downtown area, you don't go to downtown Tampa. You go to Ybor, right? And the same thing has happened. If 20 years ago, if you wanted to live in Ybor, it'd probably cost you like $250 a month. It was like nothing, you know. But now those apartments, the ones that are right on top of those clubs, the hip popping clubs and the hookah lounge and all the rock venues and things like that. Now those are some of the most expensive places to live in the city.
Dude, I wouldn't even say Ybor because Ybor's gentrification. I mean, yes, that is true, but I wouldn't. I mean, Ybor's gentrification is nothing compared to Seminole Heights.
Yeah,
Seminole Heights, which people are. I mean, we're gonna get fucking. We're gonna get doxxed for this, FYI, if we ever blow up. But like areas like Seminole Heights, and even if you go on broader scales, like in Harlem and the Bronx and Brooklyn, Boyle Heights in California, like area that is like predominantly Spanish speaking, being completely gentrified. However, they have an extremely active movement against those things. And that's why I think going back to uneven development and relating gentrification to uneven development, the best pushback against uneven development at a local level is not really calling your local officials or local planning office. It's organizing that community against it. Because let me tell you, when those communities are organized and they show up and they drive elections or they force people out of certain areas or they challenge developers or get enough people together, to challenge them, with lawsuits and all that sort of stuff, real things happen. Rent control gets instituted, like all those sorts of things are real and achievable.
Like in Portland, like in Oregon.
Right. They're real and achievable under this current system. But it's not going to happen from strictly a policymaker level. It's not going to happen from strictly a planning level. The people, the public, have to drive planning and policymakers in that direction. Otherwise, it's going to be managerial state for the real estate state.
Yeah. Let's face it. Sometimes you have to throw a Molotov at a Starbucks.
Right. Sometimes you have to just go full Antifa. No, just kidding. But anyway,
cut that out.
Is that James Comey at my door?
The answer to all of this is community organization, solidarity, and awareness and education of why these things are happening this way. So the fundamental problem here that we want people to get educated about and understand is that these are markets. These are modes of production under capitalism, markets for these types of commodities. So without a market for these things, we can focus on the need of the community at a small scale, on a local scale. What do these communities need to be able to develop socially, economically, interpersonally, and enhance the well-being of the people there, rather than privatizing everything and basically just giving that benefit to the rich real estate investors.
Right.
And this bleeds over into most every aspect of social life, like Kevin sort of touched on in our interview. This bleeds over into so many aspects. Capitalism is almost the entirety of the way we socially interact with the people. But to kind of zero in on an example is like, Betsy DeVos, who was trying to basically get in there and privatize education and divest and defund from all of these public infrastructure for education so that these charter schools can come in. And this is very much a part of uneven development as well.
Yes.
These things compound each other and they influence each other. And there's a distinct correlation and relationship between all of these factors of divesting and underinvesting in public infrastructure and schools, and basically funneling everybody into a privatized system where those who can pay for it get better results and everybody else suffers, because structurally markets cannot produce equity. They cannot produce equitable results because there's always going to be someone exploited in a capitalist mode of production, and there's always going to be someone benefiting from that exploitation.
So with that said, how does uneven development foster reactionary and nationalistic tendencies?
Like we kind of said earlier, uneven development can also affect like poor white communities as well, especially in like a globalized economy where cheap labor is outsourced to foreign labor markets. So naturally, this can foster a sentiment of like economic protectionism, like Trump's policy with China that's currently going on. And this may foster a climate of racial or ethnic prejudice toward other workers. Maybe after this happened with Trump, some workers of Chinese descent face some discrimination in the workplace. These are like what I would consider microaggressions, and we don't have a good way to like make statistics for these because often they're isolated incidents and they're not reported and things like that. But obviously these social tensions happen in that sense. But like more reactionary pundits or economists may say that, some countries develop as the result of like a greater genius of that population. So obviously that's a really like racist sentiment,
right.
saying that,
Some eugenic shit.
Yeah, so like Americans do it so often with like Japanese people. They say Japanese people are so smart, they're so good at math and STEM and all
Their
this stuff.
culture is just so
They're
so
just
right, yeah.
so, culturally more disciplined and superior in that way. And honestly, like while that may be true in some cases, like there's also a large and burgeoning like NEET culture in Japan where people are not doing these things and they're collapsing under this social pressure that they've been put under. A lot of this reactionary sentiment that we hear from pundits and other grifters, like Tucker Carlson and people like that, these are things that are very racist and they have very reactionary elements in their premises. Beyond that, basically this idea in a structural sense sort of has the effect of shielding Europe and the Western powers of the global North from any type of culpability in the exploitation or underinvestment in the global South. It's this sentiment that makes people feel okay, or just that it was a matter of course or a course of history that these things happened, rather than a deliberate phenomena of colonialism or imperialism. So obviously there's a large, ethnic tension element to this. And it's not something that I think we can sufficiently cover in an hour or even a week's time. But it's something that I hope that we work to explain over the course of our project on the podcast. But ultimately, I want to just restate, uneven development is a direct product of colonialism, imperialism, capitalist markets extracting resources and underdeveloping places. Uneven development is a direct legacy of those things, and all of those things have racist and ethnic bias and ethnic injustice intertwined in the events, in the phenomena, and fueling them in a structural sense.
All right, so just wrapping up here, guys, let's talk uneven development. Let's talk local examples of uneven development.
Right, so local, we kind of talked about, there are a lot of elements to local uneven development. It can be gentrification. It can be like the displacement of an original or historic community in a local geography. It can also be things like white flight. This is a very, very prominent example. And I have a link to sort of like a graph of just how prominent this was in some of the US's major cities. But white flight is essentially when white people are vacating and leaving the urban centers, flocking out into the more rural and suburban area, away from ethnic populations of Hispanic people and Black people and Muslims and other things like this. They're basically in white flight away from these centers of ethnic communities.
The cities were always hotbeds for a lot of working class peoples of all different ethnic, national, racial backgrounds, like historically in the US. However, this notion of white flight that Matt was mentioning, it specifically was called white flight because the mortgages and the access to home ownership post World War II, industrial boom, all that sort of thing, were given and only written off to explicitly white populations in America. And so it completely took all of those people that were granted access to a series of jobs and educational and social infrastructure that just were not given towards other groups within the city, and push them completely out to the periphery. And even if they may have been given access to those things in the city, all future and further investment went out to those predominantly white peripheral suburbs, hence the whole conception of white flight and all that historically.
Obviously, it can be an economic element. It can be fueled and fostered by a political element, like in the case recently with the Eagles Landing community in Atlanta, Georgia, where a white community tried to essentially secede from the community with the black mayor because they wanted more real estate development so that they could have a TGI Fridays on the corner of their community. But it's like, that's just one example. Like the example that we mentioned earlier would be the privatization of schooling and the defunding of public education in order to garner investment in privatized education and charter schools. That's another element of local uneven development. And all these factors can compile and compound each other to create what we consider legacies or histories of uneven development that affect social relations, conceptions of justice. We'll get into in later episodes, law enforcement. It affects interpretation of the law and treatment of certain groups of individuals under the law. And it has a multifaceted effect, and it can be related to many, many markets and factors within a local economy. And then like on a national scale, we talked about Zambia earlier, but they're a very copper and mineral rich country. And so when the British South Africa Company, a colony of Britain, moved into there in the 19th century, they basically got mineral rights and started extracting these resources, but they didn't develop any other sector of that economy in that country because it wasn't profitable to them. There was no reason to. They wanted every person that they could in their colony to be working on the most profitable thing. And when you're looking at something in terms of a colony where you don't care about the development of their populations, all that really matters to you is the resource that you can extract and the profit that you can make off of it. So that would be a national example. And even the next door neighbor, Tanzania, which was the hub of the Arab slave trade in history as well. So that is another market that opened up that was used to basically underdevelop the rest of the country because slavery was such a hotbed and such a hot market that produced so much profit for a very exclusive few amount of people. And then finally, I would say like a global example would be like the global north and the global south, which we've reiterated throughout.
But specifically, I think through like agencies like the IMF, the World Bank, like even just from their own like national trade policies that completely like sanction off or subsidize their own workforces, making the products that they produce like cheaper on a world scale, like we do with our own agricultural exports and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for our listeners that may not be, up to speed yet, really, when we say global north, global south, this is just a way of recognizing a pattern of exploitation of resources and labor by the global north, which is the U.S., Canada, Europe, Australia, and other, predominantly white bourgeois places, and how they historically have a pattern of exploiting the global south. So that's really all that means. The relationship between those two regions is sort of identifying a pattern in uneven development, in and of itself.
So Matt had talked about how in-depth these issues can be, how many different kind of facets can go into making a situation really complicated, especially for people of lower socioeconomic status. I think like an example that's really good, and Matt had alluded to it in an earlier answer, was the school system. If you look at a school and you say, why is this school failing? What's wrong with this school? Usually when you take a look at it, it's because something like lack of funding. And where does the funding come from? In the U.S., it comes from property
taxes. Yeah.
Well, why is there not enough property tax revenue? Well, the value of the homes are low. They're appraised low. Oh, okay. So why are the homes appraised low? Well, there's not really much business opportunity around there. Well, why is there not any business
investment in the neighborhood?
Yeah, and why is there low investment? Why is there not enough business opportunity around there? Oh, well, there's not really any qualified heads in that area. There's not really anybody that's educated. No one's really doing anything.
It's a
why is
cycle.
that?
It repeats itself.
Oh, it's because there's bad schools. And so this is exactly just to throw another Marxist buzzword in here, right? This is exactly what a dialectic relationship is. This is multiple factors playing into something, and there's really no answer to it. There's no what came first, the chicken or the egg. It's all part of one big cycle.
Yeah, and like you said, the taxes from the surrounding community goes into the public infrastructure for the education. But when there is not enough investment there, people don't put their kids in those schools.
Yeah.
They don't invest in that area. And then the education system doesn't produce people in that area. And then you have a system and a cycle of poverty and just communities that are bereft.
Ripe for a prison market.
Right, exactly.
And
exactly.
even if someone does succeed, even if someone goes against all the adversity and they do super well, right? Like bootstrap dream, right? A lot of times to find a career, they move out of that city.
Right.
They go to a place that has a really nice college, or they go to a place that does have careers that are already established. And so they don't actually bring the market in. It stays outside of that local town or city or whatever it is.
Definitely an awesome discussion. And we're going to have topics later on in other episodes that feed into this idea, reinforce it, but also take from it. So this is a very important concept for, any leftist, Marxist, socialist to understand. And with that, I want to mention to our listeners who have been enjoying our content, we've recently released on Spotify. So you can find our podcast on Spotify now. We're also on Stitcher, CastBox, PocketCast, and Apple Podcast. Any of those major platforms you can find us on. Our content is free. We want you to be able to listen to it and share with your friends completely free. We have a Twitter that you can reach us at, and we want people to talk to us about these issues and tell us their experiences and maybe suggest topics to us or suggest things that they want us to talk about on our show. And we want to thank you guys, from the bottom of our hearts for listening if you've kept up with us this far. So thank you so much.
And if you have, please rate us on iTunes.
Before we get out of here, though, I do want to issue an apology to the people in West Virginia. I'm sorry. I'm sorry you live in such a shitty state.